1989, a group of 30 teenagers were hanging around Central Park, New York. Some were causing mishaps, harassing and hurting pedestrians and homeless people. The next day, 28-year-old Trisha Meili was found naked, gagged, and unconscious in a ravine, having lost roughly 80% of her blood. She was in a coma for the next 12 days, which during that time, the case of the Central Park Jogger arose, becoming a prominent case in New York City. And after 2 days, 5 black Hispanic boys, aged between 14 to 16, who were part of the group of teenagers, had given videotaped confessions to the crime. They were known as the Central Park Five.
This is Coffee Over Court, and today we are breaking down the Central Park Jogger case, one of the most discussed cases in forensic psychology. A case that explores false confessions, juvenile vulnerability, and coercive interrogation, and helped strengthen rules requiring legal representation during questions of minors and bring awareness to the risks of interrogating juveniles for long periods, helping push for the mandatory video recording of interrogations in many places.
Today's drink is a homemade espresso Neapolitan ice cream.
Let's try it. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah.
It tastes like a very sweet and thick affogato. Yeah.
Okay, we'll be analyzing the full case while breaking down psychological and legal factors that influence the outcome. Let's dive right in.
On April 19th, 1989, 28-year-old Trisha Meili had been jogging at Central Park, New York. At around 9 to 10 p.m., Trisha Meili was jogging in a relatively secluded area of the park when she was brutally attacked, beaten, raped, and left unconscious on the verge of death.
The next day, at around 1:30 a.m., Meili's unconscious body was found and rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, she had lost a huge amount of blood and remained in a coma. The case led to a widespread public outcry, demanding the immediate arrest of the perpetrators. Responding to local reports of a group of teenagers causing disturbance around the park on the same day as the attack, police started stopping and questioning people who fit into these descriptions: Black and Hispanic teenagers. Police believed that these teens may be connected to the attack due to proximity and age.
5 of these teenagers stopped were identified as being seen at the park on the day and were quickly separated and interrogated. These 5 were 14-year-old Kevin Richardson and Raymond Santana, 15-year-old Antron McCrae and Yusuf Salam, and finally 16-year-old Corey Wise. Keep in mind that during this time, New York allowed the interrogation and questioning of minors without a lawyer or parent present. Although these teenagers were informed through the Miranda warning, psychologists argue that because they were kids, they likely just didn't really understand these rights well, especially because they were under intense stress. Now, there is a weird thing though. Under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, children have the right to protection from coercion during interrogations, the right to have parents or guardians present, and the right to legal counsel, so on and so forth. But the US at the time was one of the few to not have ratified the UNCRC, and they still remain as the only member state that hasn't ratified it. There are a few reasons to why they are doing this. Firstly is that the US law is widely state governed, so the US essentially feared that if they ratified the UNCRC, international bodies would begin to overpower the system and state authorities. Secondly, there was a lot of conservative and religious groups within the US that argued that the UNCRC would undermine a lot of parental rights, especially with Article 14, which addresses freedom of thought, conscience, religion, was most contested by these conservative and religious groups. Now, this is because these groups tended to believe that them parenting their children under kind of these religious beliefs weren't really something that they were choosing to do, but it was something they had to do as parents. So this is why they kind of argued against the UNCRC. Lastly though, there was that US perspective that they believed that domestic law was enough. They didn't want international bodies to intervene, they thought it was unnecessary, and they thought it would breach their sovereignty. Another thing though, ratification needs 2/3 of the Senate to approve the matter, and this is a huge amount of approval you need to ratify it, especially because these kind of issues aren't going to be a clear yes or no. So it's really hard to get a majority in these kind of things, which is why the US still hasn't ratified it. This creates a deadlock. I'm not saying that the US has to ratify it, but there is a reason why the UN literally guides member states to protect their children in that way, right? And so the way these teenagers were treated were literally nowhere near what is advised, right? They were being mistreated, and so there was a structural failure to protect children as a result of the US kind of prioritizing this state authority.
In order to understand the reason for their false confession, we need to analyze their interrogations. Their interrogations each lasted for at least 7 hours individually, although some were much longer, like Corey Wise, who was treated as an adult due to being the oldest, although he was only 16. His interrogation lasted for over 12 hours. During their interrogation, the Reed interrogation technique was used. This method became popular via John E. Reid, a polygraph expert and former Chicago police officer who had a reputation for getting criminals to confess, making his technique a popular method since the 1960s and taught to hundreds and thousands of law enforcement as a predominant interrogation method. Although this technique was also at fault for initiating multiple false confessions in the past.
Wait, so you've explained the origins of the Reed interrogation technique, but how exactly does it work and how is it used on the 5 teenagers?
Okay, so to put it simply, the Reed technique consists of 3 components: factual analysis, behavior analysis interview, and interrogation. Firstly, factual analysis is where investigators gather information about the crime scene and about the suspect, such as age, background, behavior, and possible motives. The goal is to make an educated guess about whether the suspect is likely guilty or innocent, based on these handfuls of information. It also helps the police figure out how to question the suspects more effectively. For example, what might motivate them to talk, or how may they respond to questions during interrogation.
And then they move on to a behavior analysis interview. Investigators ask non-accusatory questions to analyze if the suspect is being truthful. First, they ask basic background questions to learn personal information and see how the suspect talks and behaves while answering questions normally. Then, they ask behavior-provoking questions designed to make truthful and deceptive people react differently. This process helps with forming a rapport on how suspects answer questions truthfully and deceptively, building a rapport with the suspect so they are more comfortable talking and planning an effective interrogation.
Finally, the investigator brings the 9-step interrogation. In short, they firstly lie to or inform the suspect that there is evidence which shows they are guilty. Next, they offer a moral excuse for the crime, like blaming circumstances on someone else in a sympathetic way. Denials or objections are dismissed in order to keep the interrogation from going off track. The technique explains that innocent suspects are less likely to ask for permission to speak and are more likely to just deny the accusation. The suspect is then given 2 guilt-based options, one more acceptable than the other, to encourage admission of guilt. OLR gave an example on what an interrogator might say. Quote, "Did you plan this thing out or did it happen in the spur of the moment?" End quote. Once the suspect admits guilt by choosing an option, the investigator reinforces the confession, asks for more details, and finally transfers the oral confession into writing or in video. The reason this method works is because it builds a theme which presents a moral or psychological excuse for the suspect's behavior, reinforcing the suspect's justifications for committing the crime.
Okay, so applying this to the interrogation of the 5 teenagers, the investigators split up the 5 teenagers into separate rooms. Since they had no actual evidence, they fabricated evidence to tell the teens. For example, one of the teenagers was told that his fingerprints were found on the gun. They also made each teen believe that the others had already confessed to the crime, although they had not. Investigators then offered excuses for the crime and said they would reduce the punishments if the suspects just confessed. Now, before you ask, it is actually completely legal for police to lie to the culprit during interrogation. Now, finally, after hours of interrogation, 4 out of 5 confessed to the crime and were recorded. Confessions are typically viewed as concrete evidence of a person's guilt. With no other evidence relating the teens to the crime, they were found guilty and detained. Once the statement was out, neither the incompatible semen DNA sample nor the mismatched details provided within their confessions mattered.
In fact, as you probably know by now, these 5 kids were completely uninvolved in the crime.
But if they were innocent, why did they submit these confessions? Weren't they aware of the consequences? And why would they even admit to something that they didn't do?
Let's talk about the psychology around the conditions which led these teenagers to false confession. The issue with your assumption is the phenomenon known as the fundamental attribution factor. This is when people underestimate the power of external variables. Applying it to this case, we aren't considering the high intense stress that the boys were under during interrogation, during which interrogators lied about evidence and lied about other boys' confessions. This essentially made the boys feel trapped and guilty, even for a crime they didn't commit. Juveniles are particularly vulnerable to the pressures of police interrogations, because their brains are still developing, making them more susceptible to social pressure and authority influence. A particularly vulnerable suspect may even begin to doubt their own memory when repetitively presented with false evidence.
Additionally, in an interview with The Guardian, one of the boys stated, quote, "I would hear them beating up Corey Wise in the next room. They would come and look at me and say, 'You realize you're next.' The fear made me feel really like I was not going to be able to make it out." Quote.
So, after intense interrogation, these suspects became convinced of their own guilt and accept an internalized false confession. Another factor leading to the false confession is cost-benefit analysis. The confessions were long, causing the boys to be extremely exhausted, both mentally and physically, and would have likely just wanted to go home. The police took advantage of this by communicating that a confession will be rewarded with lenient sentencing. So these vulnerable kids, who just wanted to escape the huge levels of stress, saw it as a quick escape from the situation.
After 2 trials, they were convicted and sentenced to serve 7 to 13 years in prison, with Corey Wise, the eldest, serving nearly 13 years in prison from 1989 to 2002. He was affected the most, and it was unfortunate. This is because Wise wasn't even a suspect initially. He was targeted by the police after he voluntarily came to the police station to support his friend Yusuf Salam. Then he was targeted because of his age. He was the oldest and he was 16 years old, so the police took advantage of that to hold him for longer and interrogate. Then he served 13 years solely because of his age. And so it really shows us how much one classification and the legal system can impact the outcomes and how it can actually be exploited.
During this time, Donald Trump sent a reported 85,000 on 4 full-page adverts in New York newspapers titled, "Bring back the death penalty! Bring back our police!" The Central Five, referencing the adverts, discussed how they were deeply afraid for themselves, for their families, for their loved ones.
In fact, the media at the time was beyond vicious and categorized. They named the teenagers with a lot of racist and aggressive commentaries. They called them very inflammatory names like thugs and a pack of wolves. It was demonizing, right? And then despite the fact that forensic evidence to even prove their guilt was scarce, the media didn't stop. And so there was a lot of racial tension and division spread as a result from this attitude from the media targeting these teenagers because of their race. It wasn't only detrimental to these teenagers and families themselves, but there was a wider impact on communities in New York City, and it really polarized and segregated these communities. Essentially, Black and Hispanic communities were being scapegoated as a whole. This really shows how human rights of not only the teenagers but wider communities were breached as a result, and shows us how destructive media can be in these cases.
In 2002, Matthias Reyes came forward as the real perpetrator for the crime. Matthias Reyes had been previously convicted of a string of rapes and murder and was in prison. During this time, he'd come across Corey Wise twice. In 2002, after his second time meeting Corey Wise, Matthias came forward for the rape and attack of Meili when he was 17, confessing that he had acted alone. He was able to tell the police details about the crime that wasn't public, as well as his DNA matching the scene of the crime. After 12 years, he finally took responsibility for his crimes, saying he felt it was definitely the right thing to do. The Central Park Five now became the Exonerated Five.
Finally, the 5 boys, now men, were cleared of all charges, having almost served their full sentences. Reyes never suffered the amount of hate and backlash for his crimes that the 5 went through.
On their release, the 5 filed a civil suit against New York City and rightfully received $41 million in settlement. Corey Wise received the biggest share of $12 million because he was the only one who had been sentenced as an adult, and therefore spent the longest time in prison. Speaking in a 2012 documentary about the case, he said, quote, "You can forgive, but you won't forget. You won't forget what you lost. No money could bring that time back. No money could bring the life that was missing, or the time that was taken away."
This case is essential in understanding factors around false confessions. We need to understand factors to consider someone has confessed to a crime and to look at it with more depth.
And that's the Central Park jogging case broken down for you. Thank you for staying this far, and we'll see you in the next one. Coffee over court out!